Welcome to the Reconnection Club podcast, the show that helps parents heal troubled relationships with their adult sons and daughters. I'm your host, psychotherapist Tina Gilbertson. Each week, I'll offer you compassion, clarity, and personal development tips designed to help you reconnect, not only with your child, but with yourself. Now let's get started. Truly good apologies from parents to their estranged adult children often include statements about changes that they, the parents, are working on. This is often an important part of letting the adult child know that the relationship they shared in the past won't be exactly the same in the future because it will be better in the future. The idea of necessary change is that whatever disappointed or hurt the child to the point where the bad outweighed the good for them won't be part of the relationship going forward. And hopefully the adult child won't need the distance they currently need if certain changes hold. And that will be a happy time for both parent and child, and grandchildren if they're part of the picture. So in communicating about change, parents will want to tell estranged adult children things like, I'm working on being more open to different points of view, or I'm working on being less critical, or listening more and talking less. If you've said some things like this yourself, or if you're planning to send your estranged adult child a message about what you're working on, this episode has some steps you can take to make it stick. Because saying you're working on making changes is a good start, but it's not the same thing as making those changes. I wrote an article about this subject, about how it's easy to say I'm working on this or that, but harder to actually do it. And I gave a couple of examples in that article. You can find it at reconnectionclub.com/working, and I'll also link to it in the show notes. Let's talk about how to make necessary changes, because in most cases of parent-adult-child estrangement, behavior change is on the wish list. And if your adult child's behavior needs to change as well, then the changes that you make might just inspire them to make whatever adjustments they need to make to hold up their end of things. But somebody has to go first. So how will you change the behaviors that you've identified as problematic for the relationship? Here are 4 steps to take in order to make an actual change rather than just thinking or talking about it. Step 1. Define the problematic behavior. Sometimes we're in such a hurry to change that we're not really clear on what the behavior is that we want to change. If you're not sure what that is, there are 4 good places to look for clues. First, you can use your child's past complaints about you. Mom, you always do this, or you never do that. Second, if you don't remember any specific complaints, you can examine the themes or symbols that seem to come up repeatedly in interactions you've had with that child over the years. Third, you can always look to your own family of origin issues for problematic dynamics, since most of us have some pattern or way of behaving that we can identify from our families of origin that's not ideal for peace and harmony. And one more place to seek clues about problematic behavior is anything that's come up more than once in other relationships. For example, if you feel you're codependent with your spouse or friends, codependency will also probably play out with your children. If you tend to feel rejected or to withdraw from relationships when you're hurt, or if trust is difficult for you, there will likely be some version of that with your kids. So all of that falls under step 1, which is to identify and define the problematic behavior that you'd like to change. Make sure you know exactly what that is and what it looks like when it happens. Step 2 is to write down the circumstances or situations that evoke the problem behavior you just identified. When and with whom does the behavior tend to show itself most? What is the underlying threat that you may be responding to without realizing it? If anger is a part of the behavior, is there a softer feeling underneath that? The purpose of this step is to get more of a handle on motivations and triggers for the behavior. So write down as much as you can think of about what leads to the behavior. And if you have a counselor or therapist, this is a wonderful use of therapy time. Therapists tend to be pretty good at helping people understand themselves without judgment. And that's really important. This is not about finding ways to criticize yourself. It's about understanding yourself better. Step 3, after you've identified the behavior and what causes it, is to create a plan of action for change. And one of the first things you'll need to do is to figure out what might be necessary in order for change to happen. Sometimes we feel safer with behaviors that are problematic. For instance, taking control is often a way that people seek safety. It doesn't feel good to be on the receiving end of controlling behavior, but the person who's being controlling is often soothing himself, maybe unconsciously, by taking control. So in making a plan of action to change, you've got to take into account what has to be in place before you can even consider behaving differently. In the case of controlling behavior, you may need to feel safe before you can let go of control. And then there's the practical question of what will I do instead of engaging in this behavior? And also, what are my cues? How will I know when I need to get back on track? This is also something you can work with a therapist or coach to put in place. So step 3 is to create a plan for change that makes change doable by taking into account any built-in obstacles and gives you something else to do instead of the unwanted behavior. And lastly, step 4, it's very important not to skip this one, is to put your plan into action. And believe it or not, this is a step that can easily be overlooked. Something that I know that I do, and maybe you do it too, is I think that just knowing I need to change something and knowing what to do instead means that I'm working on it. It's a subtle form of self-sabotage. Because if we're not doing new behaviors every day, we're not actually working to change. And so we're not actually changing. How do you put your plan into action? I love the Nike slogan. It's so useful in personal growth. Just do it. Do the change you want to make. There is no substitute for doing. Thinking, intending, understanding, studying, learning, planning, those are all great things and necessary things, but none of those is a substitute for doing. Do use therapy, books, classes, groups, or whatever you need to support the new behavior, but be sure that every single day you find a way to do the change you're trying to make. That's the hardest part in some ways, but without it, there is no change. And remember, your estranged adult child does not have to be involved in your practice. If you know even one other person in the world, you can practice with them. Before I wrap up, I'll go over those 4 steps for making changes again. Step 1 was to identify the problem behavior, the behavior that you want to change. And I suggested 4 different places to hunt for clues if you're not sure what the problem behavior is. In your child's complaints, in the topics or themes of your conversations with her or him over the years, in your own family of origin, and in your other relationships. Step 2, after you've identified a behavior you'd like to change, is to recognize and document the circumstances in which it occurs and why. What causes that behavior? Step 3 is to create a plan to replace the problem behavior with one that works better, taking into account that there may be some emotional work to be done before you can let go of the old behavior. And then step 4 is to make sure you're working your plan by doing something every day to lock in new replacement behaviors. Remember, if it's happening in your relationship with your child, it's likely happening somewhere else in your life as well. Change isn't easy, largely because we don't always take all 4 of those steps. We may stall at step 1 or 2, or we may get all the way to step 3, but then we don't practice. You can do all 4 steps. Please do try this at home and let me know in the Reconnection Club forums how it goes. Until next time, remember that you are a loving, lovable, and still growing human being. So please take good care of yourself. Bye for now. If you've enjoyed this episode of the Reconnection Club podcast, I invite you to check out reconnectionclub.com. The Reconnection Club is for parents at any stage of estrangement from their adult, child, or children. So whether you've just realized there's trouble between you, you've been living with estrangement for years, or you're newly reconciled but still walking on eggshells, the Reconnection Club is your essential resource for information, support, and continued personal growth. With our courses and workshops, expert interviews, monthly Q&A calls, and a friendly, active community, the Reconnection Club is a wonderful place to be for anyone suffering the pain of estrangement from an adult, child, or children. So check it out at reconnectionclub.com.